Hello and welcome to another Arsecast Extra, as always, with James from Gunnerblog. James, good morning to you.
Good morning, Andrew. Bright and early.
It is. It's earlier than usual for both of us, I think.
It is, yeah. And it's earlier than it feels earlier than it is, as I was just saying before we start recording, because of the clocks.
Yeah, the clocks thing. They went
clocks
forward.
Have gone
forward. Spring forward, fall back, to use an Americanism, but it's always helped me remember, because it's like, oh, do they go forward or backwards? When do they do? Spring forward, fall back. Fall, of course, is the wrong word for autumn, but you know.
Listen, we're prepared to negotiate on that. It is a good little sort of aphorism, isn't it?
Sure. It helps you remember. Did you enjoy your lost hour's sleep? Are you going to make up for it somewhere along the way?
Oh man, I've lost quite a few hours sleep this weekend, unfortunately, because I've got an ill toddler.
Oh no!
So the hour I gave up to the clocks is actually the least of my worries.
I can imagine.
It's all the other hours that I'd like back,
yes,
if possible.
Well, there's no getting them back. I'm sorry, they're gone. They're lost forever.
Such is the nature of time. How does it impact you at all? Do you feel it? I think you do notice that lost hour.
I noticed it this morning when I got up. I got up quite early. I got up about 6 and it was still dark. Whereas last week, if I was getting up at 6, it was quite bright. It'll catch up again. That's the great thing. It catches up very quickly. You get the longer evenings, which are brilliant. And you get the brighter mornings, which by mid-April it should start being, bright around 6 o'clock. So, it's only 10 days of that sort of weird light thing going on. But yeah, it's fine. I don't really worry about it too much. As I said to you, it's not like the old days where we have to go from room to room manually putting forward the clock. It's all digital these days. Our phones do it. The oven does it magically. Even the oven knows.
Actually, my car often doesn't know.
Neither does mine. Or it
What's
didn't
that about?
Used to. I don't know. I'll have to go and check. I'll check that out later. It's a very important piece of information that the people would want to know. Does my car tell the right time?
My brother is possibly a psychopath, and he puts he has some manual clocks in his house for a start.
I have one in the kitchen, which I haven't touched yet, but yeah.
Okay. Well, he would hate that you've not touched it yet, because he sent me a photograph pointing out that he had put his forwards at some point yesterday afternoon or Saturday afternoon, whenever it was, like hours before the event itself.
Right.
What are your thoughts on that?
I mean, does he have a basement filled with canned goods and bottled water? That's
Probably,
my question.
To be honest.
Yeah, he's a prepper, isn't he?
He's a prepper, yeah. He gets himself onto the right time hours in advance.
Yeah, just in case there's some kind of cataclysmic time event, some kind of space-time continuum fuck up. Or at least he knows his clock is right,
Exactly that.
You were at the anti-Tottenham event this weekend, I believe.
The anti-Tottenham protest.
Yeah, the anti-Tottenham protest, dressed up as a kind of bunch of half-naked men grappling with each other in all kinds of poses. But the reality is it was just a way to assemble people to express their disdain at Tottenham.
Yes, 20,000 people, I believe, bought tickets at arguably extortionate prices just to be there. I was at this wrestling event at the O2 on Friday, and it was televised, and there are moments where they have kind of commercial breaks, and to fill those commercial breaks, they do that sort of what I would describe as a sort of highly American thing of like panning to different people in the audience and asking them to, I don't know, dance or get off with each other or whatever it might be.
Just randomly
people,
throwing the gob on the person next to you. Yeah,
exactly.
What a world.
And at one point, I think they were exhibiting signs that fans had brought in with them, banners and the like. And they cut to one, and it just said, "What do you think of Tottenham?" which was great. And I don't know if that was the catalyst, but then later in the evening, there was kind of an impromptu chant of stand up if you hate Tottenham, which I felt like it had been laid on, especially for me, actually. It was really lovely.
Yeah, it was good. You sent me a video going, can you hear this chant? And like, even though it was quite distant on the recording that you have, it's unmistakable, isn't it? It is one of those, just, you can't not hear it. Wherever it is, regardless of how loud it is, the sentiment, I think, permeates the universe itself. Therefore, it sort of manifests itself into your ears.
I do think it kind of manifested from nowhere, because my sort of working theory is there was a Scottish wrestler, female wrestler in the ring. Right. And I think this chant probably started as "Stand Up If You Hate Scotland."
Ah.
But on recognising the tune, enough people joined in. Just like they heard the call. Do you know what I mean? The bat signal went up and they were like, I know that tune.
Yep.
And it morphed. And by the time it sort of spread through the stadium, it was very distinctly "Stand Up If You Hate Tottenham."
Amazing. That's
incredible.
So good.
And lo, we did stand.
The people stood and they hated Tottenham.
And it was good.
And it was good. Was the wrestling good?
It was, man. It was entertaining. I had a good night, making full use of the... Well, actually, I was going to say international break, but Arsenal invented something new called the FA Cup break, where we're not in it anymore. Yeah. And so we just get another weekend off.
Did you watch any of the FA Cup football?
I didn't really.
I didn't either. Not a bit.
I watched a little bit of Manchester City turning things around against Bournemouth.
I can't be. I want no part of that.
Yeah, and I wanted to see Eddie Nketiah's goal. Just, they're few and far between at the moment, Andrew. So
he's scored a few of late. Like his start to life at Palace has not been brilliant, but
maybe he's turned a corner.
Maybe. A bit more playing time.
Saying the corner.
There's always another corner. That's the thing about corners. You think you've turned the corner, then you go down the road, and somewhere along the line, there's another fucking corner.
Exactly.
We're not living in Roman times anymore, where the roads are just straight. There's always
we live in a grid
corners,
system.
Roundabouts, T-junctions.
No.
How's anyone supposed to get anything done? I don't know. Anyway, there was a big story this weekend. Bolt from the blue. Arsenal have officially announced Andrea Berta as the club's new sporting director.
Yes.
There's a lot to do.
On Mother's Day, no less.
Yeah. He ruined Mother's Day for everybody. All the dads. Charles Watts was sitting at the fucking Mother's Day dinner on his phone. What's happened? Oh, Andrea Berta's been appointed sporting director.
Mother's Day's cancelled, guys.
Mother's Day's off. Sorry, Charles. But he told a good story, along those lines on Friday's podcast or Thursday's podcast. Yeah, not exactly a surprise to anybody. This has been common knowledge for a while, but it's now officially official.
It is. It is. He's here. He's here, and he's very slim. That would be my main observation.
Very slim. Okay.
Yeah, I mean, big appointment. It is a big appointment.
Yeah, and there's a lot to do and a lot to sort of improve on. Could you say that things can only get Berta? No.
Oh wow!
Sorry, that's terrible. Jesus.
Won't be long until we're hearing that ringing around the O2 arena,
singing a chant for the sporting director. My goodness, what a world! But no, it is an interesting appointment, and obviously, it has been a topic of conversation for quite a while. It was November when Edu left.
Early November.
So we're in March, just about March now, and we've got it done, and they've gone through a process. And I know you've written a piece about this for The Athletic, but in terms of how detailed that whole process was, and the interviews and the people that they brought in, the people they talked to and considered for the job, am I right in thinking that they did bring in somebody from the outside, like a recruitment people, to manage this and to sort of get all these candidates lined up, and, you know, to what extent do you know when it comes to like interviews and those kinds of things, like were they detailed with all of the candidates that have been mentioned? So like the Dan Ashworth, Roberto Olabe, et cetera, were they all interviewed or were they just considered?
It's a good question, because it's a difficult distinction, actually. Like a debate we had in the office was like, well, what counts as an interview? You know, is a conversation the same as an interview? The process was that there was an initial piece of the work done by an outside external agency who identified a number of candidates, held conversations with those candidates, kind of sounded out their interest. And from that, they put together a shortlist. The people on that shortlist had an interview with Richard Garlick, managing director, Tim Lewis, the vice chair, and Mikel Arteta. And then I think there was a final stage, which was with the ownership in the form of Josh Kroenke, which I know at least Andrea Berta and Jason Ato were at. There may have been one or two others. Difficult to say with precision because there were so few people involved, essentially, at that point. But yeah, I think most of the names you've heard progressed pretty far in the process. I'd say Roberto Olabe, who I know was talked about a lot, his unavailability was certainly a factor. You know, he was very clear with Sociedad that he wouldn't talk to anybody else until the end of the season, and that effectively took him off the market for Arsenal because they wanted to get an appointment done before the summer. Dan Ashworth, I think, did have lengthy conversations, but I think he's looking at other opportunities, potentially return to the FA.
Okay.
Trying to think of other names. The guy from Monaco,
Scuro?
Scuri, I think is his name. Scuro, that's it. Yeah. He got pretty far. I think he was right in towards the end of the process.
He sort of, am I remembering wrong, or did he sort of rule himself out at some point recently with a kind of like, oh, I'm very happy at Monaco kind of statement? I think.
Possibly. I suggest that might well have been.
Yeah, in the event that he was told thanks, but no thanks.
Yeah. I mean, I always heard conflicting things on him about his willingness, to make the move, but I think it certainly was an opportunity he was willing to explore. I don't know. I think the clear choice was Berta, and my understanding was it was kind of between Berta and Jason Ato at the end. That was sort of the dilemma that the board were considering, and they recommended Berta, and that's who we've got. And yeah, I mean, it's a guy with vast experience, someone who's been in the job at Atletico Madrid for more than a decade, experience in Serie A before that. Someone who I imagine they're expecting to help Mikel Arteta get what he needs this summer. A guy who they hope can get deals done, a guy with an extensive business background. And he starts, well, he kind of informally has already started, but I think he officially starts today. All
right. First day on the job for Andrea Berta. I do want to talk a little bit about, him and Mikel Arteta and that dynamic in a second. But I'm curious, about how he is integrated, because in your piece in The Athletic, you said his English still needs considerable work, which is understandable if he's not spent a great deal of time operating in English. He's Italian, so his Italian and Spanish are going to be really good, and those are big languages in the world of football, I guess.
Yeah.
But the dilemma that you spoke about with him and Jason Ato, so is it within the realms of possibility that despite perhaps some disappointment on Jason Ato's part that he didn't get the job himself, and I'm sure, that's something everybody will understand. If you've gone for a job, you didn't get it, you feel a bit like, oh, they brought somebody else in. Is it within the realms of possibility that even if he might want to explore other options at some point to have a more senior role at a club, to fulfill his own ambitions in the game, that in the short to medium term, he can be to Andrea Berta what he was to Edu, while Berta settles in, while he improves his English. He obviously has a great deal of knowledge about the club and the way it operates and the recruitment and all those kinds of things. And Berta might want to do things his own way, and that's fine. That will be his remit. So where do you think things will go with Jason Ato?
Yeah, I don't know. I'm not someone who spent a great deal of time in kind of corporate environments. But people have said to me, usually if someone internal goes for a post and they don't get it, that is kind of a precursor to them leaving.
Sure.
That very often goes that way. I think if Arsenal can keep hold of Jason Ato, even in the short term, I think that is a win because, like you said, he could help the integration. I mean, the sporting director job, I know we as fans, we talk about it as transfers and first team men's transfers at that.
Yeah.
But it's bigger than that. There's a wider remit, wider responsibility that goes across many departments at the club.
While we're on that, I mean, do you have any information as to that? Because that was a question that, we discussed when it comes to Edu, because ultimately Edu's remit was the men, the women and the academy. Is that the same now with Andrea Berta? Do we know that? Or is he very much focused on the men's team and the work he's got to do with Mikel Arteta?
Great question. I do know that they never discussed changing the title or the position with candidates. It was never like, maybe we'll just have a technical director.
Yeah.
It was always, we want a sporting director with all that entails. And I would imagine that's part of the attraction of the position for someone like Berta. So I think they will have the same breadth of responsibility, but at the same time, I think this is an appointment that is made clearly with an emphasis on the men's first team.
Okay.
I think I hate to sort of distill it too much because maybe Andrea Berta will prove me wrong and he'll be heavily invested in the academy and the women's side and other departmental stuff that we probably won't even know about. But I look at this and say they've gone for a guy to get the players that Mikel Arteta wants. That's my overriding feeling about it. As for Jason Ato, I think if they can keep hold of him in the short term, it's good. If only because, think of the work that's already gone into the summer. I think there needs to be a kind of handover there. And I think it would be good to keep him around. How do you do that after him not getting the position? The answer is probably quite simple, isn't it? You probably give him a pay rise and some slightly redefined role, and probably that resolves it.
A little.
Depend.
Yeah, sorry, I was just going to say something that looks a little bit different on the CV than assistant to Edu.
Yeah.
So if and when at some point he decides he wants to explore opportunities elsewhere, he's got a sort of another notch on his belt, if you like.
Yeah, and listen, I think Jason's been a very divisive figure among fans. I think he's carried the can publicly for January in a way that I personally think is a bit unfair. I think it was more kind of a club issue than a one person issue, and I think that there's probably a lot that someone with his abilities and connections and, like you say, knowledge of the club can offer. in the coming months. So I hope that that's the way it goes. I think it would help Andrea Berta. But a lot will depend on the chemistry between them. I mean, he was Edu's assistant because from day one, when Edu arrived, they had a great understanding and a great connection. And it's not a guarantee that he'll have that with Berta.
Yeah, sure.
So let's not forget, when Edu came in 2019, within, 6 months, a year, we'd seen pretty much the entire scouting department laid off.
And the previous, head of football operations or whatever title Raul Sanyehi had at that time as well.
Yeah, but before that, even you had the likes of Francis Cagagao and Brian McDermott and many other Peter Clark, like well regarded scouts who'd been with the club a long time,
sure,
were let go. And it might be that we see a similarly tumultuous period once Berta's got his feet under the desk. I just think this summer, we are basically on the precipice of the summer, and I think they probably should keep things as stable as possible through that to give themselves the best chance of success.
Sure. We had a lot of discussions at that time when Edu made those changes to the scouting department, right? And I think ultimately what he did in that department versus the players and the quality of the players that we brought in, I think you would say, it worked for him. Like, not every transfer was a hit, obviously, but I think generally speaking, we have improved the squad to the point where we've been title challengers. So that speaks to the quality of the recruitment and perhaps the quality of the scouting. Where I would ask a question is, was that approach, when Edu made those changes, was that him saying, okay, this is the old-fashioned way of doing it. This is the new way of doing it. This is the world we live in now. And of course, the sort of surreal lockdown nature of the pandemic period played a part in that, right? Where things were brought internally. Do we know if that was, let's say, singular to Edu, or if that is more commonplace, if that's the sort of the way that big football clubs operate now, or is this going to be very distinct from the way that Andrea Berta wants to operate? I would imagine, given the fact that he's in the role now and was so willing to take the role, that it can't be a case that he's looking at Arsenal and saying, right, I've got to come in here and make a whole load of changes. We need 500 scouts around the world attending third division games in Brazil, blah, blah, blah. So I guess it's probably simpatico with the way he kind of operates.
Yeah, I would think so. I mean, I must say I don't know a great deal about the scouting network that he had at Atletico and the extent to which he'll look to replicate that here. But I agree with you that Arsenal's recruitment has largely been very good. I think our frustrations may be at stuff that didn't get done last summer or in January. I don't think should overshadow, in general, what's been a really good period of recruitment at Arsenal. I mean, if Edu had wanted to continue in the job, he'd still be there. I think people would. I think the board and the fans more broadly sort of thought, we're doing all right on that front. So I think we have to be. I don't think we need to throw the baby out with the bathwater.
Sure.
But equally, I recognise that these kind of big appointments often bring with them transition, change, evolution, and it would be odd if that wasn't reflected. I mean, the other point, we talk about Jason Ato and what his role might be. Andrea Berta might well have in mind his own equivalent to Jason Ato. He might have an assistant or someone he wants to be his right-hand man. He might want someone with a certain profile, or he might want someone who, let's say, has a better knowledge of the English game than him, but is his own person. It wouldn't blow my mind to see that kind of appointment follow his arrival. So it's a wait and see, I guess. But equally, as I said, we are right on the verge of the summer transfer window. So we can't afford to do too much waiting. And
No. The other key thing to this, of course, is the relationship with Mikel Arteta. And from what you've said and others have reported, that Arteta was in favour of Berta. He was the preferred candidate for Mikel Arteta. There's like a few ways, or a couple of ways really, to look at this. I think there's some people out there who think that a manager's influence in the appointment of a sporting director is a bit, because ostensibly the sporting director has a kind of authority over the manager in a way at most clubs, right? And I understand that. Because players and managers are more transient usually than executives, right? So the sporting director has to have this measure of authority. And I get that some people would want those two roles to be very distinct, for the club to appoint the guy, without the input of the manager. But to me, that doesn't really make a great deal of sense. I'm much more inclined to think that, when you're a manager like Mikel Arteta and you do have, I don't really want to use words like power and control because it sounds a bit nefarious. I don't mean them that way, but I think we all understand the position that he's in at Arsenal, right? To me, it just makes sense that Mikel Arteta has some input into what is a key appointment for the club, because ultimately this man has to get him what he wants. And it doesn't mean that Andrea Berta just is there to do the bidding of Mikel Arteta, right? No. That's not good. That's not healthy. I don't think that's a situation anybody would want. But I think the two, if we are to have success, if we want the trophies that we desperately crave, these two men have to work together really well. There has to be a compatibility with those two, right? And an ability to work together, an ability to communicate, as well as an ability maybe to discuss and debate and to, have differences of opinion. This is where I think this appointment is so interesting because of where he comes from. Diego Simeone at Atletico Madrid is a guy with power and control at Atletico Madrid because of what he's done there and the job and the work that he has done for so many years at that club, right? It just establishes him with that kind of authority in the position of manager. I'm not saying Arteta is exactly the same, but it is similar, right? And they are very singular characters. They're very driven, very determined. They know what they want. So I think Berta's ability to deal with and work with and cooperate with and be compatible with somebody like Diego Simeone is a really, really interesting aspect to this whole situation.
I agree. I think that may prove to be the perfect preparation for working with Mikel Arteta. Diego Simeone, I believe, is the highest paid manager in world football. He's a man who carries an enormous authority at Atletico Madrid, and Berta will have considerable experience. I wouldn't say necessarily managing him, but as you say, engaging in debate with him, in placating him when necessary, pushing back when necessary, and kind of managing that relationship, for the betterment of the club. And I think inevitably, if this works, this appointment, he'll be doing a bit of that at Arsenal too. I do think the conventional European model is sort of the sporting director at the top and the coach beneath that. And that's partly about sort of, org charts and hierarchy, but it's also about reporting structures. I think in a lot of European clubs, the sporting director is the guy who liaises directly with the board or the ownership, and then feeds that back to the coach. That's not the case at Arsenal, where someone like Mikel Arteta has really direct, open communications with, someone like Tim Lewis, for example. Arsenal have always talked about Edu and Mikel as a partnership, and I think it's right to consider Andrea Berta and Mikel in the same way. And the success of that partnership will have a huge part in determining our collective success, I think. So, it makes absolute sense to involve Mikel in the process. We'll never know exactly quite how much sway he had in the final decision. I suspect some. I think his point of view would have carried a lot of weight in those conversations. But perhaps that's right. I saw underneath my piece yesterday in The Athletic this debate kind of play out, and there were some Arsenal fans saying, are we giving too much power to Arteta by involving him in the process? Is that the right way round? Do you have any time for that as a perspective? Or
I mean, to me, it would be just completely insane not to include him to some extent in that process. Like, is the final decision his? No. Does he have some input? Yes. And that makes sense to me because, he is the man in charge of the team. He has to be able to work with whoever this person is.
Yeah,
it would be,
and he's one of the most qualified football people in the club.
Well, that's just what I was about to say. I'm not saying there is a dearth of football knowledge at executive level because there are, people like Richard Garlick there, who's worked in the game for a very, very long time. But I think, that sort of direct input into what the team needs, like, does Mikel Arteta know better than anyone else what he wants or needs from the transfer market this summer? Yeah. Does that mean he shouldn't be open to other ideas from a sporting director who, I think because of his experience and because of where he comes from and because of, not quite the hullabaloo, but because of the title that he has at Arsenal, has a measure of authority as well. It's not like he's coming in to play like, some kind of subservient character, at the feet of Mikel Arteta. I get you what you want, master. He has authority because of the role that he's in. And to me, it would just not make any sense whatsoever for Arteta to be excluded from that,
Yeah, I think that's an important point on Berta. I don't think, based on the conversation I've had around him, that he's a wallflower. I think this is a guy with a big personality, with an ego, which I think you would expect from someone in such a high-powered position for so long at Atletico. And I find it hard to believe that he's just coming in to, play second fiddle to Mikel and do everything that's demanded of him.
I mean, do you think Mikel Arteta is under any illusions as well about, what kind of character he's dealing with and the environment in which he's been working for the last... Yeah, people often... So. Yeah, people will say, people in power, they don't like to be challenged, and that could be true. But I mean, to me, Arteta backing a guy like this is him basically acknowledging that, like, there will be discussions, there will be debates, there will be differences of opinion, because you don't hire a guy like this and you don't back the hiring of a guy like this unless you expect that and you're open to that challenge, Well,
let's put it like this. I mean, I think if you were Mikel Arteta and you were looking to sort of consolidate your authority over football matters at the club, you'd probably throw your weight behind a more junior candidate.
Correct.
For example, a Jason Aito, in the knowledge that, that would probably strengthen your own position. He's gone for, as we said, an experienced senior voice who, particularly once he's settled in, I think this summer's a really interesting one because it's sort of a question of how quickly we begin to feel Berta's influence. But yeah, I think you're right. I think surely this is a sign that he welcomes that kind of creative tension potentially.
But he always talks, doesn't he, about like wanting to improve and to to maximize every transfer window, to maximize every opportunity, to maximize every aspect of the game. You know, I think he's got good coaching staff around him. He's obviously a hugely talented and influential coach himself in terms of the improvement that we've seen from this team. You know, the disappointment of this season's Premier League notwithstanding, there are, you know, issues and reasons and explanations for some of it. But, you know, the willingness to have your ideas, whether it's recruitment or whatever else, be challenged, I think is something that is, you know, inherent to Mikel Arteta.
Yeah, I think so. And coming back to that partnership, you know, we spoke about the language being an issue. Well, it won't be an issue between those two, you know. Berta's been working in Spain for 12, 13 years and presumably will have, you know, very very easy communication with Mikel.
Arteta speaks all the languages anyway.
To be fair, he does, yeah. He can do Italian too. Yeah. So they'll be all right, which I think is really important. So yeah, I feel like if Arteta, I feel like when Edu left the club, it was very easy to look at that as a bad thing, and I think it was in the first instance a bad thing. I think it was the timing was unhelpful, in some respects unexpected. And, you know, it kind of shook the foundations a bit of the project. But knowing Mikel Arteta as someone who looks at every crisis as an opportunity, you know, and I think he will have looked at this sporting director situation and thought, okay, we've lost Edu. How can we use this? What can we add? What can we bring in that can add a different dynamic, a different dimension? Because they are at the point where they are still trying to take the final step. You know, they are still trying to change from challengers to champions. And I don't think Arteta will have been adverse to trying something different. Yeah. And I think in terms of personality, in terms of experience, in terms of just who he is, Berta is a case of trying something different. When I think appointing Ato would have represented continuity and more of the same. But I think Arteta probably thinks maybe we need another external impetus to give us that final step. Yeah,
we've had loads of questions, you know, in the past about, like, does he need something different with his coaching staff, for example? Exactly. And we've had, you know, does he need a new assistant manager? And that's no criticism of Albert Stuyvenberg. But, you know, that idea...
But Mikel has been ruthless with that. I mean, he moved on Steve Round to promote Carlos Cuesta, for example.
Yeah, exactly. But the idea that it has to be the coaching staff when it could be somebody at executive level who could bring that sort of change or that difference in dynamic, I think is really interesting. Yeah.
So I'm fascinated. I mean, you know, I'm really curious and keen to see how this plays out and how it works, because it will depend so much on relationships. And, you know, you can only tell so much in an interview. And you know, and there's relationships in different directions. It's not just about Mikel and Andrea Berta, but it's also about Berta and his team and Berta and the board and, you know, all these different dynamics that are going to shape how we operate moving forward.
Well, that's it. You know, he's going to come in, he's going to have his ideas. You know, there will be plans in place for the summer. He might have some slightly different plans, and I think we'll leave the discussion of Viktor Gyokeres to part 2, because we just had like a bazillion questions about that. Okay. So we'll leave that to part 2, which might be, you know, an indicator of you know, what we get from him, that like the club have got these ideas and he's like, well, what about this? And, you know, how far do they push and where do they meet in the middle? Arteta is meeting the press today. There's a press conference at 11 o'clock. You know, we're recording 8:45 now, so you'll be off to that shortly. So I'm curious as to, you know, what he says about it. Look, publicly, he pretty much always says the right thing. I mean, do you think from the club's perspective that it's a fairly low-key appointment, right? Announcement, sorry, not appointment, announcement. They did it on a Sunday. I was saying to you, the last Arsenal announcement I can remember being made on a Sunday was when we signed Takuma Asano. So it was sort of like, what? It was Sunday, Mother's Day, all of that kind of stuff. Not a great deal of pomp and ceremony. There's a picture of him with Richard Garlick signing his contract. There's some, boilerplate statements from him and from Josh Kroenke. Just what you would expect. Arteta will speak about it today. Do you think from the club's perspective, they just kind of want it to be done and in the past, in the rearview mirror now, and let him get on with his work? From what we understand, and look, if you want to hear more about Andrea Berta and the way he's operated at Real Madrid, we did a podcast over on Patreon with Alex Kirkland from Spanish Football Podcast. He's the Madrid correspondent for ESPN FC, so he's well aware of how he's operated at Atletico Madrid. He's not a front and center guy. He doesn't strike me as the guy who's going to do the sort of glad handing, the stuff that Edu did so well, the charismatic meet and greet stuff that Edu did so well because he is that very kind of charming character, right?
Yeah.
Andrea Berta is not that guy. I'm not saying he's not charming. He could be very charming. I don't know anything about him, but it seems that his preference is to sort of operate in the background more than someone like Edu.
Yes, and I think I've never met the man, and
you never will.
Exactly. Well, possibly not, but maybe I'll run into him at London Colney today. You never know. I think he is quite a sort of hard-nosed businessman type, from everything I understand. I mean, this is a guy he's not going to be, stopping to chat to Arsenal fan television. I wouldn't imagine. In the way that Edu was comfortable doing. Edu had a real ease in the sort of public dimension of his job that I actually think is probably quite unusual. Like, I don't think most sporting directors are like that. I think that's just Edu. And he's a charismatic Brazilian guy. But Berta, I think he's going to be a very different proposition. I think we'll hear from him a lot less. It might be that he's looking to expand that part of his profile. It might be that he wasn't afforded that opportunity at a slightly crowded executive space at Atletico Madrid, and he might, see this as an opportunity to kind of push himself forward. I don't know. I thought the club announcement was interesting, the timing of it and the way it was presented. Like, nothing from Mikel Arteta in the statement, which I think is interesting.
Do you think that's sensible?
Yeah.
Because, regardless of what we've said, that perception that a manager shouldn't be involved in the appointment of a sporting director, it's not just restricted to Arsenal. I think it's more a general sense. So is that sort of smart from Arsenal and from Arteta just to sort of, like, if Arteta's in there, people say, well, his hands are all over this, da-da-da-da.
Yeah, I think probably I think the club will be aware of that kind of narrative around Arteta and, power sort of gravitating towards him somewhat. So that is a way of counterbalancing that. And factually and structurally, it is correct that it is not his appointment. This is an appointment made by the club that's been recommended by the executives and the board. So I don't think we'll see Andrea Berta walk out alongside Mikel Arteta at 11 a.m. Let's put it like that.
I don't expect that either.
Holding up the shirt. But it'll be straight to work and interesting times. I mean, change is always welcome, because I think it's gives us something different to talk about, that's for sure.
That's for sure. All right, well, look, let's take a little break here. There were questions about transfer targets in the wake of this appointment and lots more. So we will return to do that in part 2 right after this. Welcome back to the Arsecast Extra. This is part 2 of the show where we answer the questions that you sent to us on Blue Sky at gunnerblog.bsky.social and at arseblog.com. Also on the Arseblog Discord chat server, which you get access to if you are an Arseblog member on Patreon. Now, Viktor Gyokeres, is that how we pronounce it?
I'm actually not sure. Let's go with that.
Let's go with that for now until all of our Swedish listeners correct me for being completely wrong. Which I'm open to, by the way. That's fine.
Sounds like you love it, yeah.
No, I do. I'm keen to learn.
Teach us. We are
idiots.
Naive, non-Swedish speakers.
Yes. At least teach us the sort of best English way to pronounce it rather than, the actual Swedish way. Because we'll just get
it right.
We'll just
get us in the right ballpark.
Yeah, exactly. Maybe we'll just call him Victor.
Yeah, that'll do. Big Vic.
Big Vic. All right. So there's a lot of questions about Big Vic and Arsenal's reported interest in him, which came in the wake of the Andrea Berta appointment yesterday. Coincidence, not coincidence? These are the questions on the Discord. RD10 says, "Goodly morning, gents. Question for James. How long have he and his colleagues at The Athletic known about Berta's interest in Big Vic? Have you been sitting on that article waiting for Arsenal to officially announce him as the new sporting director?" And Brian Regan 09, similar kind of question with the Orn Bomba. I think you need a Jim Bomba in there as well. Jim Bomba sounds like a
Jim
nice,
Bomba.
Sounds like a nice drink, doesn't it?
Yeah.
I'll have a Jim Bomba, please. Anyway, the Orn Jim Bomba dropping on Sunday about Big Vic. Would this be something that's in the making for a while, or is it a direct pivot because of Andrea Berta, or is it a case of like 2 + 2 = 4-ish?
Yeah. How it works is this. Andrea Berta is officially confirmed as sporting director. His first call is a conference call with me and David Ornstein. That's the first thing he does with his new club phone. And he says, "Guys, I need a bit of help. The fans want a striker. What can you do for me? Make me look good, guys."
We've got the perfect solution. Big Vic.
We say, "Have you heard of Viktor Gyokeres?"
Big Vic.
And he goes, "No." No, so in seriousness, we've known about it for a little bit of time, and it was a case of not really being able to do the story until he was confirmed in the job. So there you go. That's kind of the reason for the timing of it, following hot on the heels of the appointment. So Arsenal have an interest in Viktor Gyokeres. That is news in itself because for quite a long time, that hasn't really been the case. I don't know if that's something that you've observed or that we've talked about before, but for all the conversations about centre forwards, his is a name that's been kind of thrown around, but not really with any weight of reporting around it or behind it. And that's accurate. Like Arsenal have been, I would say, lukewarm on Gyokeres until now. I think there have been doubts about the price tag at various points, about the level he's playing at now, whether he'd score goals at the same rate. But a few things have changed. So one of those things that's changed is that the price. So I think previously he had a release clause of around 100 million, something like that. Now there are indications that this summer Sporting would be prepared to deal more in the kind of 60 to 70 million bracket, which makes him a different proposition financially. And Andrea Berta's arrival is a factor too, because this is a player that he's known for a long time, been a fan of for a long time, and I think sees as a good fit at Arsenal and a potential solution to Mikel Arteta's problem. So yeah, I it's very early for obvious reasons, but I'm really curious to see how this develops because it adds another name strongly into the conversation, and I can imagine some very interesting debates in the sort of in Andrea Berta's office over the summer. We spoke about those conversations between Mikel and Andrea Berta, and the number 9 position might be the conversation.
No, I'm sure. I mean, I when I saw this, it does make sense that Arsenal should be interested, right?
Yeah.
Because,
I mean, the goal record...
I mean, it's just the 42 goals this season so far.
Sure.
That's all.
A lot of penalties in there, we have to say. I think there's something mad, like 15 penalties or something like that.
43 goals the season before that.
Yeah. I mean, look, the goals do speak for themselves. There is no getting away from that. This is a goal scorer of pedigree who's done it consistently.
Mm-hmm.
How have you... Well, I'll ask you first for what's your reaction to the idea of Gyokeres at Arsenal? I'm going to pronounce his name differently every time just to hedge my bets.
I'm just going to say Big Vic. My reaction is that I understand why Arsenal will be looking very closely at a guy like this, because if the ideal is Alexander Isak, and we talked about him last week, we have to acknowledge that it's a really, really difficult deal to do if it's doable at all. Like if Newcastle get Champions League, I don't think it's doable. I think we said that. If they don't, it's still a massive, massive amount of money to get them to the table, right?
Yeah.
Huge money. You're talking north of 125 million and probably more than that on one player. Arsenal already have Kai Havertz, who can play centre forward. We obviously need somebody else. Physically, he seems to be the right kind of profile. He's a big guy. He's, scores a lot of goals. I think, the questions that people might have about his ability to produce coming from the Portuguese league, which I think we have to acknowledge is not at the same level as the Premier League, right? So you can score a lot of goals in Portugal, a lot of goals, maybe even in France, and find it difficult to replicate anything close to that in the Premier League. But in terms of his age, in terms of his experience, in terms of his goal scoring, in terms of his price, in comparison to Alexander Isak, because, there is a lot of focus on centre forward, a lot of focus on number 9, a lot of focus on bolstering the attacking elements of our squad. But that is not all we have to do next summer. There are other things that have to be done and will have to be done next summer. So unless you're willing to sell somebody you don't really want to lose to generate the revenue to do those things, if you're going to spend 125, 150 million on Alexander Isak, then you've got to look at the alternatives. And I also think that when you look around at the striker market, when you look around and see who's available at centre forward, who's good enough, like realistically, who is potentially good enough to come in and help the team reach another level, I think they're slim pickings around Europe when it comes to centre forwards. There aren't that many around. There aren't that many available. And a guy who's got 100 goals in 2 seasons, it just seems like a no-brainer to me that Arsenal should be looking at him.
Let me ask you a couple of follow-ups. So Henry Mouland said, if you could only choose one, let's be honest, guys. I mean, I think it is about one centre forward. I've seen some people saying, could you get Gyokeres and Sesko? I just don't think that's possible. But he says, if you could only choose one, would you prefer Arsenal went for Gyokeres or Sesko this summer? A trade-off seems attacking output versus age. Gyokeres turns 27 in June. But his 43 goals assists in the league and UEFA Champions League is notably ahead of Sesko with 19 goals and assists. And at 21 is less likely to be a guaranteed starter. I mean, how do you weigh those two against each other?
I guess it comes down to personal preference as well, doesn't it?
Because with Sesko, I suppose, at 21, you've probably still got that possibility of development in his game, right?
Yeah, but it's that balance between development and what Arsenal need to get over the line and next season hopefully to win the Premier League. That's the line. I think, there is obviously some talent and potential in Benjamin Sesko. I like how he hits a ball.
On the age thing, I would say, albeit in different circumstances, Mikel Arteta was prepared to do Ollie Watkins in January. I think that suggests when he thinks about what he needs at number 9 and what he needs at centre forward, he's thinking much more about the immediate future than the sort of mid to long term future.
Yeah, I wonder. I mean, the thing about Big Vic is that the trajectory has been kind of weird, right?
Yeah, late developer.
But Didier Drogba, for example, was a late developer. Olivier Giroud, to an extent, a late developer.
Ian Wright, no less.
Yes, another great example. So you might look at him and think, okay, he's gone from Coventry to, where was he before Coventry?
So I think he started in Sweden, then he went to Brighton.
Yeah, he was at Brighton, then
had
to
a few
Coventry.
Loan spells, St Pauli, Swansea, Coventry. Joined Coventry permanently, did very well, and then went to Sporting.
And he's just fucking knocked it out of the park at Sporting. Again, your view on the Portuguese league aside, he's still scoring at an incredible rate there. So you might look at him and think, okay, there is a defined career trajectory to this guy, that he is maturing really, really well. And if you get him at 26, 27, you're looking at 3-4 years where perhaps he can develop even further, with coaching, with better players around him, et cetera, et cetera. So if you were to ask me right now to pick one, I would probably pick him over Sesko, because he feels, not that he's a sure thing, but I would feel more assured that he could score the goals. I'm not saying Sesko wouldn't be a good signing either. It's just about, the level to which we've got to get. And, 21 is still very, very young for a striker. Maybe Sesko is another guy who takes a little while to develop properly. Can we give someone 2 seasons or 2.5 seasons or 1.5 seasons even to develop into the striker that we want him to be? I think the other thing about the Ollie Watkins potential signing was it was a now signing, right?
Exactly.
It wasn't a development. It was okay, we're going to spend some money because we think this guy can do it for us now, because we know he can do it at Premier League level. So that's why I think probably it'll be Big Vic.
Could you do this? W Campo 33 says, "Goodly morning, guys. Given the Gyokeres links, can you place him and the other strikers we've been linked with on a list based on preference and potential price? For example, he's got Isak 120 million, Gyokeres 80 million. These are maximum prices in his mind. Sesko 60 million, Ekitike 50 million, and Watkins 45 million." I think knowing the exact price is difficult. But do you have a ranking in your mind of what you would most want?
I'd love Alexander Isak.
Yeah.
Who wouldn't? You can, as we've said before, you can visualize him in red and white scoring goals like Thierry Henry, right?
Yeah.
Anyone can. But I'm very aware that it's an extremely difficult deal to do financially, and convincing Newcastle to sell their star striker. You know,
I mean, they're adamant that's not what they don't want to do that.
No, I can understand. Yeah, of course they don't. Of course they don't. If they want to make more progress, and they've made progress this season, they had a season last year where it didn't quite, they didn't make any progress. I think they sort of stagnated a little bit. Was it maybe because of the difficulty of combining Europe with the Premier League, et cetera, et cetera? But I think they've probably made a step forward again this season. They've won a trophy, so they're guaranteed European football of some description. It's about whether or not it's the Champions League. If Newcastle are in the Champions League, just forget about Alexander Isak. There's no point in pining over a guy who's not going to be available unless you pay them an absurd amount of money. And even then, you could end up running in circles, in a summer where you need to be a bit more decisive. I think you have to absolutely factor in availability to your preference list.
Yeah, and I think as well you have to factor in a degree of urgency. Like, this is a summer where Liverpool, Chelsea and Manchester United are looking for a number 9 in the Premier League alone. And I think if you dally too much, or you kind of place all your eggs in one basket, and they may not hatch. I don't know if that still works, but we'll give it a go. Then you run the risk of kind of missing out on a few players. So it's a really, really interesting one. I wouldn't rank them individually. I think that there are sort of positives and negatives to most of the players in that list. My sort of controversial opinion is that I would still have Ollie Watkins in that conversation, personally.
I don't think I would. I think that ship has sailed.
Yeah, that's fine. I think if what you're looking for is guaranteed goal scoring right now in the Premier League, and you can't get Alexander Isak, I think it would be wrong to not consider Watkins in that list. And I think that people may find him less exciting or less exotic because they don't see him every week in the Premier League. But I think that he would come with certain guarantees that I actually think none of the others do. That's my take. I'm not saying he would be my second choice. I'm just saying that when you're looking at like 70 for Sesko or 70 for Gyokeres, like if there was a 40 for Watkins deal that enabled you to do other things this summer, I think that should be that should be a contender as well.
Yeah, not for me, I have to say. I think it was an interesting piece of January opportunism, but I think if you are strategizing or planning better, I think that's all it should be, And I know what you're saying about 40 versus 70, but I also think 70 in the current market, in the world we live in, and the prices being the way they are, it pays off better over the course of 3-4 seasons, maybe even 5 seasons, with a player like Gyokeres versus Watkins, who, is going to turn 30. And I know, we've seen plenty of examples, and the guy who's firing Liverpool to the title is a great one where, he's 33. You're not over the hill and dead and buried at 30, but I just think in terms of medium, long-term planning, I'd be looking elsewhere than Watkins.
That's interesting. I just think if you look at like the next 2 years, I'd be quite surprised if, like in a hypothetical world, Benjamin Sesko scored more goals over those 2 years than Ollie Watkins, for example.
Yeah.
And I'd probably say the same for Etikite. Gyokeres is the one that I don't know. Like, I feel like he's shown such incredible goal scoring power in Portugal, and it really is a question of like if that's translatable. Like, if it is, then obviously he's a great signing. But we all have the kind of Darwin Núñez clause, shall we put it, in our heads.
Sure, like coming from a weaker league where you've scored a load of goals. Yeah, exactly. Like Kezman coming from the Eredivisie, Lacazette coming from France, where he was scoring 40-odd goals for Lyon. Even someone like Sylvain Wiltord, who scored a load of goals in France, was a good player for Arsenal, but, couldn't replicate at that level. Yeah, I just wonder about him. I mean, we had a question here from Jan on Blue Sky, who's at Jan Hoppis, or Jan Hoppis. He says, how do you feel about the era of the big lads? Haaland, Darwin Núñez, Sesko, Big Vic, Havertz, even players lower down the league like Wood and Mateta. What does it say about the game that he says lumpy number 9 is the preferred choice again? Maybe it's doing those guys a little bit of a disservice. a bit better than lumpy number 9s, but I know what he means in terms of the physical profile of this player that now is de rigueur, if you know what I mean. It's the thing that people really want.
Yeah. I'm not sure about lower down the leagues, Nottingham Forest. I mean, they're pretty close as far as I can see.
Yeah, sure. I think he just probably means perceived smaller clubs. Smaller clubs in inverted commas, of course.
Yeah, and Fulham, we spoke about Fulham having it was actually, I think it was on another show, but I was speaking to someone about how Fulham play with quite a conventional target man.
Yeah, Raul Jimenez, yeah.
Spurs of Solanke. Yeah. I think it's kind of like an arms race, isn't it? Where as the physicality of the league rises, it's almost necessary. It's like, the centre-backs you're competing against. Look at our own centre-backs, by way of example. I think that the big man is back, but not just at centre-forward.
Sure.
I think if you look through the spines of most teams now, you'll see these incredibly athletic, powerful guys. Saliba, Gabriel, Declan Rice, Kai Havertz is sort of our spine, right, in that respect. I think it's interesting. I mean, football does tend to move in waves, doesn't it? And there'll be a reaction at some point. At some point, someone's going to be like, well, there is one way to... What if we circumnavigate all these big... lumpy does feel harsh, but powerful teams with Spain's old system, a bunch of little guys, playing passes incredibly quickly and moving around. I mean, maybe that will all come back round again, but it's definitely the way it's going at the moment, and it feels like with Mikel Arteta's decision to play Mikel Merino at centre forward, it feels like something that he thinks is really important.
Yeah.
I think just to win physical battles, to win the duels against the centre backs at this point in this league, you sort of need to be a pretty strong guy.
Yes, I think so.
Or an absolutely exceptional player in other respects.
Is Gyokeres left-footed or right-footed?
Good question. I don't know. When we played him, I saw him take shots off both feet.
Yeah, same. That's why I'm a little unsure.
Let's have a look. I think right, but I'm preferred foot right. Say transfer marked, and they have never been wrong.
Never. That, I think, is an interesting aspect.
Yeah.
To his potential arrival as well, because you have Havertz. Havertz is a left-footed guy. Just maybe that little bit of balance. If we're considering a forward line, you've got Bukayo Saka in there, you've got Kai Havertz in there, you could potentially have Ethan Nwaneri in there as well at some point. A lot of left-footers, so maybe we just need something. Not that it makes a huge amount of difference, but just maybe in terms of the balance, it would be interesting to bring in a right-footed player.
Yeah, and listen, I think there's probably a bit of work to be done on Mikel Arteta on this one. I think, as we said in our reporting, it's a player Andrea Berta really likes. I think, based on the last couple of years where Arsenal's interest has been kind of lukewarm at best, and I think that's kind of been reciprocal between player and club. I think there was a sense of Arsenal doesn't feel like it's going to be their destination. I think there'd be a bit of work to do on the player side, and I think there'd be a bit of work to do maybe on the manager side in terms of getting him on board. But that's an interesting test of this relationship early on, right?
Sure.
And, maybe we'll see perhaps where the power lies, or to what degree they're prepared to compromise and collaborate. I think my gut feeling is that Mikel Arteta would hold out for Alexander Isak as long as he kind of felt it was possible, but it may need Andrea Berta to sit down with him and say, it's not possible. That might be part of his job this summer. Yeah,
but I mean, it might be evident from the way this season ends that it's not possible.
Yes, that's true.
So, we could have clarity on that, pretty quickly, depending on what happens between now and the end of the season. It's going to be interesting anyway to see. There'll be such a spotlight on this summer for obvious reasons after we, didn't make the most of the last 2 windows. I think there is a real onus on not just Andrea Berta, but the club and everybody involved in this to make sure we get it right and to fill the gaps as well as we can,
Wouldn't it be great if, like, the centre-forward thing was resolved early-ish in the summer? It's such a big piece of what Arsenal are going to do this window. I do think it would be amazing if it was like, we've done that job and can plan accordingly. Yeah,
there's 2, that really stand out for me. 2 deals that need to be done, which is centre forward and midfield.
Yeah.
And from what we understand, despite some rumours in Spain about Zubimendi and Real Madrid, that guy is very, very high on the agenda for our midfield signing. And then after that, I think, you're able to sort of surf the market, if that's the right way of putting it. You've got your centre forward, you've got your striker, you've got your addition to the forward line. You've replaced 2 veteran midfielders who will have left at that point with somebody like Zubimendi. There are still some questions, I think, about the way you put together your midfield in the wake of his signing and everything else. But those are the 2. And I know people might say, well, goalkeeper, we've got to get a backup goalkeeper. And I'm sort of less worried about that. I think that's not relatively easy, but, it's not the biggest priority. I know we have to have one, but I think that's something that you can get done over the course of the summer. But those 2 are the ones for me that really need to get done. And if they get done quickly, then I think it gives you a good platform to operate with over the course of the rest of the summer.
We had a question about the goalkeeper situation, so I might chuck it in. Le Jackal said, "Goodly morning. With the quality of Porter and Setford in the academy, do we need anything more than another loan or possibly veteran backup to Raya? He plays 90% of matches anyway, and in the early stages of cup competitions, we should have too much for most opposition."
Well, I don't really know about the quality of Porter and Setford, to be honest. I mean, I think they're obviously...
Porter is so young.
Exactly. I don't think we should be talking about him. He was, had an amazing moment last season, but that was down to circumstance,
Yes. And as for Tommy Setford, I think the feeling, the hope, he was kind of supposed to go on loan this season and play. And again, circumstance sort of didn't really enable that to happen. I think the expectation is that he will get to go on loan next season, and therefore he can't really be relied on as a backup. So,
I mean, we've got to bring somebody in. Absolutely. I do think we need to bring somebody in, or, for me, maybe the easy way of doing it is keeping Karl Hayne. Our Estonian friends tell me that's how you pronounce his name, Karl Hayne.
Okay.
So he's playing every week at Real Valladolid. There is that conversation about, does he want to play second fiddle again? I just think sometimes, the club can make a decision that suits the club more than suits the player, if you like. If you can give him some cup games, some of the EFL Cup games, the FA Cup games, maybe even some Champions League group games, depending on, how it goes in the Champions League next season, assuming we get there, of course. That seems to me to be a cost-effective way of having a number 2 goalkeeper in a summer where there are probably priorities in terms of spending, because, you might want, let's say, not just a number 9, you might also want to add a winger, another attacking player to the mix, or an attacking midfielder to the mix as well. And I would be reluctant to spend a great deal of money on a number 2 goalkeeper when there's probably a solution internally that allows you to kick the can down the road a little bit, maybe to the following summer.
Yeah. I think the question on Karl Hayne is he an Iñaki Kanya goalie? You know, we know from the way our goalkeeper recruitment has gone that Iñaki's very specific about who and what he wants to work with. Mm-hmm. And does he see Carl as a stylistic fit, or perhaps even a temperamental fit for his sessions, his way of vision of how he sees the goalkeeper position? I'm not sure. I don't think. I think in the same way that I say Mikel might need a bit of convincing about Gyokeres, I think Iñaki might need a bit of convincing about Hayne. But from a club perspective, I absolutely see that it makes sense. And look, Jean Garcia, I'm sure is a fit for the way Iñaki wants to work and the way he wants his goalkeepers to play. But I do have this kind of nagging thing in my head of it feels like an awful lot of money for a player who's not going to see many minutes. And I know that can change overnight. But I do wonder if there is a more sort of expedient solution, whether it's Carl or somebody else. It's an interesting one, that one. But I agree with you that holding midfield and centre forward are the big ones. And then, to be honest, I am kind of much more excited and interested in if we can add another creative player than another goalkeeper. But
yes, me too.
I accept that the needs of the squad, are what they are as well.
What about this question from Garode, who's at garode.bsky.social? He says, "Hey gents, interested to know why people talk so much about managing minutes when it comes to Ethan Nwaneri, but the same is rarely mentioned with regards to Miles Lewis-Skelly."
That's interesting, yeah. I mean, I had a question that was sort of similar. Solo said, "I see a lot of talk about managing Nwaneri's minutes as he breaks into the first team, but I don't see as much talk for other players like Lamine Yamal. Is that just because I'm only focused on Arsenal-related media, or do you see that as an oversight from other clubs?"
Do you think it's, rightly or wrongly, there's a perception that perhaps, generally speaking, forward players are a bit more fragile than defenders?
Yes, or that the physical exertion or the type of physical exertion is, I don't want to say more demanding, but maybe more risky or more conducive to injury. Yeah,
you're more likely to be kicked as the attacker, whereas when you're the defender, you're probably going to be doing some of the kicking, if that's, a very simplistic way of putting it,
And I think the types of sprints and the frequency of sprints and the length of sprints, maybe there's a perception that there are more in attack. Mm-hmm. You need only look at how managers rotate. Typically, they're rotating their forward players more than their defenders. Typically. They're substituting forward players earlier in games, whereas they're not with defenders. Again, that is evolving and changing, but that broadly has been the sort of the way it's gone. I must say on the first question, I think there has been talk. I think there has been talk about managing Miles's minutes. Maybe it's been less discussed in terms of the physical cost, but more sort of, when he's found himself in trouble with referees or on the wrong end of headlines. There's been a lot of conversation about taking him out of the spotlight at moments, hasn't there?
Yeah.
And that's maybe detracted from the conversation about the minutes. But
do you think maybe what Mikel Arteta has said about the two players is part of it as well, where I think Arteta has been relatively open about Ethan Nwaneri not struggling, but needing some time to come to terms with the increased load that you have from playing as a 16, 17-year-old at underage level. All of a sudden you're making a step up to the first team. Inevitably, there are going to be some challenges in that regard. And I think there was one game where he said something along the lines of, Ethan was cramping at halftime. So he got to halftime and he was cramping because of the work that he was doing and because of how hard he was working on the pitch. Whereas I don't remember him ever mentioning anything like that when it comes to Miles Lewis-Skelly. Perhaps it's not something that Miles Lewis-Skelly is dealing with in the same way.
I do remember Miles coming off with cramp. I think it was in... Maybe it was the Carabao game, the Bolton game.
Yeah.
The start of the season. Ethan also had that muscular injury as well, didn't he? Quite early away to Brighton, which might have played into some of our fears and stereotypes maybe about attacking players and injuries. The other thing is to say, although we always pair them and talk about them in the same breath and they've played through the age groups together, there is a difference in age between them as well. Miles is 6-8 months older than Ethan.
Does that make a big difference?
I think it can at that age. I think between 16 and 21 or whatever, there's so much physical development happening. You don't know what a big difference that could make.
Yeah, it's not a one size.
They'll have loads more information on that than we ever can.
Not a one size fits all thing, is it? That players mature physically at different rates.
Wayne Rooney at 16 was more mature than
I am now.
Yeah, exactly. I think the question about Lamine Yamal is really interesting. That's a guy who went straight into the first team, into the national team, almost without hiccup. Now, is that because we weren't there? We weren't watching week in, week out during his initial ascension, and it was a bit more 2 steps forward, 1 step back? I don't know. I also wonder if, are we as Arsenal fans a little bit... kind of attuned to worrying about this? Do our experiences with the likes of Jack Wilshere, say, inform our position on this? Do we have a kind of generational trauma around young players overplaying?
When you think about the players who came through at the youngest age at Arsenal in, let's say, this relatively modern era. Aaron Ramsey was very young when he signed from Cardiff, and then look, the injury he suffered was, and the injuries I think subsequently that he suffered were a consequence of that horrendous Shawcross challenge, right? But it still impacted his career. Jack Wilshere, again, injuries beget injuries. Cesc Fabregas, even, having come through at 16, went through a period where, remember, he had hamstring problems.
Yeah.
Remember, he came, was it Aston Villa? He came off the bench, scored twice, and went off because he did his hamstring again. He'd come back, and I think he missed the Carabao Cup final because of that, or the EFL Cup final. I can't remember. But, those guys who came through at a young age, Theo Walcott, again, another one who suffered a big injury, but, that through line between all of those players starting at a young age and being somewhat impacted by injury at certain points in their career, it's in all of our consciousness. At least, those of us who are old enough to remember that.
Even Thomas Rosicky, he played men's football from the age of 17, and I think, admittedly, he played men's football from the age of 17 in the 90s, so I think he attributes the kicking he received in that period as one of the primary reasons for the many injuries he suffered later. It's an interesting one. It's an interesting one, and I don't know if we're oversensitive. Is it still the case that playing at the highest level in Spain is physically a different prospect to playing in the Premier League? 20 years ago or 30 years ago, I think that would have been true. Now?
I think it is slightly physically different. You know, the Spanish league has always been maybe a bit more technical than the Premier League down the years. But, you know, go watch the video of Diego Maradona playing for Barcelona. And what was his name? Was it Gyokeres? Was that the guy, the centre half who used to play for Athletic Bilbao? It is one of the most brutal football videos you will ever see, where this perception of Spain being where it's all tiki-taka, all technical, all the nice passing players. But, you know, there were some right bastards back then as well, you know? True. So I think it's just a case that we probably understand a bit more about the physicality that's involved with football, and, you know, things like physical maturity and development and load and how to manage injuries is a world away from where it was even 20 years ago, 25 years ago, you know. So I think we're just more attuned to the idea that a player starting very young, A, is at a physical disadvantage in those early years, and B, might sort of pay the price a bit down the line for starting that early, because that's been, you know, the story of a lot of players down the years.
Yeah, I think that's probably right. Like, you know, we're probably right to have those concerns.
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, it is interesting, isn't it? You know, now we've got a few players back, Martinelli back, Saka, yeah, we'll find training, out. Of course. It'll be interesting to see exactly how many sort of minutes Ethan Neri gets. To what extent the brakes are kind of put on his development.
Yeah, I still think he's got a big role to play this season, even when Saka is back. You know, I think those two are like a sort of, they're going to work in tandem a bit, I think, you know. Yeah. As a way of kind of getting the best out of both of them, we can use them in different ways, but use them together, you know, which I think is very valuable. We'll find out more anyway from Mikel Arteta, because he's going to talk to the press, as we said, at 11 o'clock today. Apart from questions about Andrea Berta, there will be questions about Bukayo Saka and whether he's going to be in the squad for the game against Fulham tomorrow night, which we haven't mentioned, but we will talk about that in more depth over on Patreon later on this afternoon. Our Premier League preview podcast will look ahead to that game against Fulham, and we'll talk about whatever Mikel Arteta has to say in his press conference. So you can join us for that over on Patreon. Just $6 a month. It's patreon.com/Arseblog. I think we better leave it there, because you got to get on your bike and get yourself to London Colney, and we've got to get this podcast out to everybody. So thank you so much, as always, for listening. Hope you enjoyed the show, and we will catch you on the next one.
Bye-bye.